So when you think about what brought down history's biggest empires, what's the first thing that pops into your head, right? Probably huge armies, legendary generals, maybe some rival king. But what if I told you that the real threats, the most dangerous challengers, they weren't kings. They were queens who had been pushed way, way too far.
You know, they see the most dangerous person on Earth is someone with nothing left to lose. And that's exactly what happened here. These empires, they push these women past their breaking point. And they didn't just, fight back. Oh no, they unleashed a kind of fury that would honestly make the gods themselves nervous.
And look at these numbers. I mean, they're just insane. These aren't just stats on a page. 80,000? That's the body count from just one Queen's Revenge tour. 65? That's how many military forts two sisters took down riding on war elephants. And 40,000? Get this, that's how many pirates called one woman their boss. Her fleet was bigger than most countries' navies at the time. All right, so let's dive into our first story. We're heading to Roman-occupied Britain. Now, the Roman Empire, they were pretty arrogant, right? They figured they could just control the local Celtic tribes with a few shady deals and some puppet kings. Yeah, they were about to find out the hard way that when you humiliate a queen, you don't just spark a little rebellion, you get a full-blown, blood-soaked reckoning. So, here's what went down. Boudica's husband, the king, he dies. And the Romans, they just rip up the treaty they had with him, they storm in, seize her entire kingdom, and steal all the royal wealth. But they didn't stop there. No, they wanted to make an example of her, so they dragged her out, stripped her naked, and whipped her in public. And then they had their soldiers assault her own daughters. It was just an unbelievable act of arrogance, and it was the last mistake they'd ever make with her.
But here's the thing. That humiliation, it didn't break her, not even close. It forged her into a weapon. Boudica stood up in front of all the tribes of Britain, not as some broken victim, but as the living, breathing symbol of all their rage. And everyone, from peasants to nobles, they all flocked to her side. They were thirsty for revenge, and she was going to give it to them.
So, with this massive army, something like 200,000 strong, she just unleashed hell. She rolls into the Roman capital, Cumbula Dunum, and burns its defenders alive inside their own temple. Then she marches on Londinium, what we now call London, and slaughters every Roman in sight. After that, she burns the city of Verulamium, which was full of Roman sympathizers, completely to the ground. This wasn't a war anymore. This was straight-up annihilation. Okay, but the Romans weren't just going to roll over. Their governor, a guy named Paulinus, was a brilliant and brutal tactician. He gets his 10,000 professional soldiers together and picks the perfect spot for a fight. He finds this narrow gorge to funnel Boudica's massive army into a kill zone, a place where their sheer numbers became totally useless. And here's the tragic part. The Britons were so sure they were going to win, they actually brought their families along to watch the victory.
And that professional Roman army, it was basically a meat grinder. The Britons charged in, got cut to pieces, and then total panic. They tried to run, but they were trapped by the wagons of their own families who came to watch. The Romans showed zero mercy. And Boudica, instead of being captured and paraded through Roman chains, she drank poison. She chose to die a free queen on her own terms.
Okay, let's jump half a world away. It's only a few decades later, and believe it or not, another empire is about to learn the exact same lesson. We're in first century Vietnam, where two sisters are about to take on an empire. And they weren't just fighting an occupation. They were fighting for the survival of their entire culture. And yeah, they did it from the backs of war elephants. See, the Han Chinese weren't just there to collect taxes and boss people around. They were trying to force something called sinification on everyone. Basically, they were trying to replace the local Vietnamese culture with their own Chinese ideals, which included this really strict, male-dominated social structure. And this was a huge deal, because in the local culture, women were equals, often even leaders. So this wasn't just a rebellion, it was a war for their very identity.
And just like with Boudica, the spark that lit the fire was personal. One of the sisters, Trung Truc, her husband publicly protested against the awful Han governor. So the governor had him executed right there in the open. He probably thought, that'll shut them up. Big mistake. It did the exact opposite. Trung Truc and her sister, Trung Nhi, they called all the clans to war, and their right of choice, well, it was pretty epic. So, in the spring of 40 CE, the sisters literally ride into battle on these massive elephants, leading their army, and they just start steamrolling Han garrisons. I mean, they were totally unstoppable. They captured an insane 65 Chinese strongholds, they kicked the Han completely out of Vietnam, and Chernchak was crowned queen. And what's the first thing she does? She gets rid of every single one of the awful taxes and laws the Han had put in place. They ruled for 2 years, a glorious 2 years. But the Han Emperor wasn't going to let that stand. He sent his most legendary general, a guy named Ma Yuan, to crush the rebellion. And facing this superior, professional army, the sisters were eventually defeated. But, just like Boudica, they would not be captured. They walked into a river and drowned together, choosing their own end. And in doing so, they became martyrs and symbols of Vietnamese resistance that have lasted for centuries. So, you see a pattern here, right? Boudica, the Trung sisters, incredible stories of defiance, but they both end tragically. Well, our last story? It's different. This is about a woman who didn't just beat the empire. She made the empire pay her to stop. This is the story of, hands down, the most successful pirate who ever lived. I mean, the story of Qing Shi is just the ultimate power move. She starts out as a prostitute working in a floating brothel and ends up as the commander of the legendary Red Flag Fleet. When her pirate husband died, she didn't just, take over. No, she brilliantly outmaneuvered all her rivals, forged this rock-solid alliance, and transformed a ragtag group of pirates into what was basically a naval empire, complete with its own laws and its own economy. So how did she keep thousands of ruthless pirates in line? This is where her genius really shines. She created this incredibly strict code of laws. It was non-negotiable. All the loot they stole, it was centrally registered and then distributed fairly. If you disobeyed an order, you were beheaded on the spot. But get this, and this is brilliant, any pirate who assaulted a female captive was immediately put to death. That rule alone created a level of discipline that was just unheard of. Her power grew so massive that the Chinese government, the Qing dynasty, finally decided, okay, we have to take her down. So they send this huge imperial fleet after her. And Qing Shi, she doesn't just defeat them. She absolutely annihilates them. She captures 63 of their ships and pretty much destroys half of their entire navy. The government was completely powerless to stop her. So she's defeated the Chinese. Then she goes on to defeat the Portuguese and the British. At this point, she realizes, you know what, I'm at the top. It doesn't get any bigger than this. She knew that the threats would just keep coming, bigger and bigger. So she did the single smartest thing imaginable. She decided it was time to retire, but she was going to do it on her terms. Picture this. She walks, completely unarmed, into the Governor General's office and negotiates her own surrender. And her terms were unbelievable. A full pardon for her and every single one of her pirates. She gets to keep all of her insane wealth. And her new husband, her second in command, he gets a job as an officer in the Chinese Navy. She just retired from piracy and spent the rest of her life running a bunch of successful gambling dens. She died peacefully at 69. She didn't just survive, she won. So you've got Boudica, the Trung sisters, Qing Shi, 3 incredible women on 3 different continents who all looked the most powerful empires on Earth right in the eye and didn't blink. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other stories just like these are out there, buried by history? What other incredible tales of defiance are just waiting for us to find them?